Hi there. This is your serial cynic coming to you from a wet, dreary day today. Out here at an old basketball park in my neighborhood, my current neighborhood. But believe it or not, I actually grew up in this neighborhood as a little boy. And this is where, as an adult, I moved back to this location and used to come out here and play basketball with my son. He's now grown and has moved on to another state, so I don't really come out here as often. But just to give you a little view, it's a dreary day here. But, well, first of all, that's a soccer field behind me. But the basketball court, there you go. Unfortunately, this is wintertime here in New York City, so the weather tends to be rather drab, dreary. There are no leaves on the trees and so forth. So bear with the rather boring background that you're seeing right now. Another thing that I have to explain is the fact that I'm taking this video. I have to do it in landscape in order for you to see the full screen. It's an annoying thing. I'm doing it here on the phone. If I did it in portrait, then you get those black bars on both sides as you see in one of my earlier videos, and I hate that look. So I compromise when I do it in landscape so you don't get the full video quality in 1080p or 720p. It's more or less 360. So bear with me at this point. I could have used my other camera at home, but I have a little boy, so I decided to step out because he's getting a little wild at home there. So I don't want you guys to be hearing all this background cooing and everything along that line. So I decided I'll just come out to the park and just do this video today. So again, thank you for tuning in. And before I go any further, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. And you can always comment, leave comments, questions, statements. Want to bite my head off, whatever the case might be. I just ask that you try your best not to be rude, if possible. With differences of opinions. You can have strong opinions, but just don't have to be nasty about it, okay? All right. What am I out here talking about? I'm coming back out here today, and my hands are freezing, so I'm going to try to see if I can make this a short video. I want to talk again about the Black Hebrew Israelites. Now, I am not picking on them because I'm trying to tell people what they should believe and not believe per se. As long as they're not hurting anybody, you know, they're not going around the place killing anybody, harming anyone, it's perfectly fine. No matter how loud and how forceful they may be or whatever the case might be, as long as they're not doing anything like that, it's all right for them. You know, country of free speech, say basically whatever you want and so forth within reason. So this is more or less just for conversation, more or less for the sake of argument, so to speak, or debate. And again, the reason why I've kind of gotten caught up in this, even though I've known about the Black Hebrew Israelites for about a good 20 or more years now, the reason why I got caught up in it is because they seem to be becoming a thing again in today's world. They're becoming rather popular. On my social media, I tend to see more and more of my friends or people who I might not know, but they just happen to be a part of the same pages that I'm a part of, who keep bringing them up, Black Hebrew Israelites, or claiming that they are Black Hebrew Israelites. I am from the Caribbean, as I've mentioned before in another video, and while I've realized that they've always been around, they've always been somewhat of a fringe group, just like they were over here. No one really took them all that serious. They have a little following here and there. But more and more, they seem to be becoming rather popular. With people like Kendrick Lamar, the rapper, who's people will look at and say he's a very conscious brother, does great work when it comes to rap music and so forth. But he is a guy that, I don't know if he is, but in some of his songs, he actually throws out some things out there that Black Israelites believe. So with the popularity of a guy like Kendrick Lamar, and a lot of people listen to his music, and him out there throwing out some things out there that you can find in black Hebrew Israelite theology, you could see where it could be gaining some popularity and publicity. And so it's becoming rather popular right now, okay? But what I want to talk about here is I was once a devout, rabid Christian. And I've read through the Bible about 4 times, cover to cover. And when I say I read through the Bible, I don't mean I just picked it up and just read some words, read a couple of chapters here and there. I mean, I was down with the lexicons. I was down with the concordances. I was down with the Bible dictionaries. I mean, I was nitpicking every little word and seeing what the Hebrew word means here and what this means and what that means. So I've read through the Bible. There's so much of the Bible that I've actually forgotten, but what I've forgotten is more than what most people know. Okay, and I'm not saying that arrogantly. It's just something that I was just really like a devout Bible reader. But unlike a lot of Christians, I was really more into the Old Testament. I wasn't really a New Testament guy, you know. I read the Old Testament. I mean, I went through that. It was just fascinating to me. And one of the chapters that I came across that black Hebrew Israelites love to hitch their theology on is Deuteronomy chapter 28. You'll always hear them mention it. Oh, well, look at Deuteronomy chapter 28. Why is that chapter so important to them? Because supposedly or allegedly, they're saying that in that chapter, it talks about the experiences of black people. But not just black people. A specific group of black people who they refer to as black Israelites. Now you say, what's black Israelites and what's black people? Well, they tend to make a distinction between black Israelites and Africans who you can say can trace their lineage back to Africa all the way through, all the way back. In other words, what they try to tell you is that in Africa, you have your African peoples, and then you have another group of people who are not originally from Africa, but rather they're from what we would call the land of Israel today. And a real quick refresher before I get back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. The reason why they do it this way, or how they do it, or how they come about this, basically, they're claiming that after the flood, Noah's flood, there were 8 people that survived. Noah and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. So what they're basically saying is that these 3 sons of Noah, after the flood, of course, everyone died in the flood according to the Bible, that these 3 sons went on to repopulate the new earth after the flood. There were 3 sons. One was Ham, one was Japheth, and one was Shem. Supposedly, Ham, H-A-M, went on to found or became the patriarch of the African peoples, along with the people of places like in ancient Canaan and Syria and those areas up there. So Ham was the father of the African peoples. Okay? Then you had the other son, Shem, who they believe, the Hebrew Israelites believe, or according to the Bible, basically became the father of the Israelites. In other words, he had children, they had children, and they had children, and they had children. And one of these children happened to be a man by the name of Abram, who became Abraham. And through Abraham came what we know as the Israelites, or the Hebrews. And then, of course, you had Japheth, and Japheth supposedly populated Europe and Asia and other parts of Asia and so forth. So this is their belief. So what they're saying now is that back in 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came down and invaded the kingdom of Judah, that some of these Jews at the time, or Israelites, or Hebrews, or whatever you want to call them, escaped Nebuchadnezzar's armies, where he took a lot of the Jews back to Babylon, which is what we would call modern-day Iraq. Took them to Babylon. But some of these Jews supposedly escaped and made their way to Egypt. I wouldn't say that there's something necessarily wrong with this. I could see that being very, very plausible. An invading army, some people escaped. They made their way to Egypt. But from Egypt, the belief is that some of them migrated and went further west, went to other parts of Africa. But the focus is a lot of them settled out in West Africa. So stay with me. So supposedly some of these Jews went to West Africa and founded kingdoms, started families, built up communities, and so forth. So we're talking about 2,500 years ago. And supposedly they build up these communities and these kingdoms and so forth. Now, when the Europeans came calling and started to look for Africans to enslave and bring to this side of the world, according to the Black Hebrew Israelites, the Hamitic Africans, remember what I said about Ham and the African peoples, their belief is that the Hamitic Africans looked around and like, hey, look at those Shemites over there, or those Semitic Africans. Let's grab them, put them into slavery, and sell them off to the white man. So supposedly all these Hamitic Africans happened to know or were able to pick out and distinguish those guys over there, those. They're not Africans like us. They're Semites. Let's enslave them and hand them over to the white people. And supposedly those Semitic people, or Semitic Africans, or Black Hebrews, or whatever, those were the ones that were put on ships and brought over to this side of the world. And this is why Black Hebrew Israelites will say, we, on this side of the world, black people over here, where we can trace our ancestry back through Africa, coming over here on slave ships, our ancestors and so forth, those are the Black Hebrew Israelites, to distinguish them from the Hamitic or continental Africans, so to speak. So that's where we arrive at this, okay? Now, Deuteronomy chapter 28, they hitch their identity on that because they try to say, hey, look, read through this chapter and see if it's not talking about the experiences that our black ancestors went through coming over here into the New World and being placed into slavery. But when you read the chapter, you really come to understand it has nothing to do with the experiences of black people over here. Can you find things in the chapter that black folks can relate to? Hey, of course. Other groups can relate to it too. Now, I stepped out of the house today, so I don't have my notes with me right now that I typed up, so I can refer back to what parts of the chapter. But you have to understand a little background to where that chapter comes from. First of all, the Jewish Old Testament as we know today, from Genesis to Malachi, was not written in real time. You didn't have scribes walking around following the main characters like David, Moses, Abraham, writing things down as they did them. The books of the Jewish Old Testament were written long after the fact of what they described, the details that are in there. They were written long after the fact. So as a result, being written long after the fact, a lot of scholars will tell you that it was written somewhere around the Babylonian exile or sometime after that. So we're talking about 500 BCE, 400 BCE, 300 BCE, somewhere around those areas that it was written. But what it's detailing in Deuteronomy chapter 28, it's detailing when the Israelites came out of Egypt. So it's going back in time and telling you the story. It's not telling you the story real time. It is written way after the fact and going back and telling you what went down. If you look at those last few chapters of Deuteronomy, and again, my hands are freezing. If you look at those last few chapters of Deuteronomy, this is Moses supposedly, in his old age, going back over the law with the new generation of Israelites. Because remember, they wandered the desert for 40 years, according to the Bible. And now Moses is up in age, realizing he's dying, and now he decides to go ahead and remind the people about their covenant and tell the new generation about the covenant that they made with their God, Yahweh. So as he's sitting there and going over, he's telling them, listen, this is why you need to follow the covenant. because the covenant has curses and blessings. If you do A, B, and C and follow the Lord, he will bless you with this, this, and that. But if you fail to follow the covenant, then he will curse you with this, this, and that. Okay? So this is basically how this is set up. So then Moses goes into Deuteronomy chapter 28, or the writer, whoever it is was writing this book, and is writing to them and telling them what the curses and blessings are going to be. But let's forget about Moses for right now. Let's bring it to the time when the book was actually written. The Jews are now in exile in Babylon. They're at the rivers of Babylon, mourning tears for their homeland of Zion, Jerusalem. And if you read the psalm, there's a psalm that tells you they're crying, they're wondering, they're bewildered, they're stunned. Like, how in the world did we end up in this situation? How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? We don't feel happy. We're mourning the loss of our homeland. And it was against this backdrop that their spiritual leaders came forward to try to make sense of it for them and say, hey, look, don't worry. You're going to be restored. The reason why you're in this situation is because you did not live according to the laws of God. The laws of Yahweh, I should say. You failed to adhere to what he asked you to. And as a result, you're in this mess. But don't worry about it. There's hope. You're going to be restored. So we go on to the rest of that. You find a lot of, in the latter books of the Old Testament, about Israel being restored and their temple and everything going along that line. But before he got to that point, it was like the leaders sat down and were like, hey, look, let me explain to you how we arrived in this situation. And then from there, they go back and tell the story. God called Moses. He gave Moses these laws. Even before that, he called Abraham. He blessed Abraham with children, who we are. You know, we the Israelites, we the Jews, we are those people. He blessed us. Then he called Moses, gave Moses some laws to pass on to us to follow. We kept breaking them over and over, going back and forth and doing this and not living up to the laws. And to make a long story short, at the end of the day, he basically allowed a foreign nation to come in and destroy us and carry us away into captivity. Thus, this is where we are today. That's the backdrop of Deuteronomy chapter 28. It was not looking 2,000 years into the future when African slavery came about. It was talking about something that had already happened, or as the belief goes, something that had already happened that was explaining why they were in the situation in 586 BC. Not in 1600, 400 or 500 years ago. That is what the chapter is describing. And while I don't have my notes with me, and again, my hands are cold right now, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 28, you can clearly tell from the context, from the vibe, that it is talking about Israel as a nation, not as groups of African tribes here and there that call themselves Semites. As a nation, it's writing to them as a nation and talking to them that another nation will come and do A, B, and C to them and commit complete destruction on the Israelite or Jewish people. And one way you can tell that has nothing to do with us as black people, the chapter details cannibalism. Now, unless somebody can show me where there was a point when these Semites were brought to this side of the world, that we engaged in cannibalism, where women were eating the children that came from between their legs, as the chapter describes, then we're not talking about us black folks over on this side of the world. It mentions a few other things in there that you can basically tell has nothing to do with black folks, because the details that's given, we black folks on this side of the world never experienced. Yes, there are details in there about sores and afflictions, and you'll be the lowest of the lowest and so forth, that black people can look in and say, yeah, you know what? Yeah, we went through the same thing also. But because that happened, or because it's mentioned, doesn't mean it's with us. The way black Hebrew Israelites are looking at this, they're going with this common mistake of correlation equals source. No. Just because something correlates or relates to you does not necessarily mean that it's referring only to you and only to your people. So again, if you look through a chapter, yes, you can cherry pick some things in there that you can find and say, oh yeah, that refers to black people. Oh yeah, that refers to black people. Or yeah, black people went through this, black people went through that. But there's a whole lot of other things in there like, that never happened to us. Our people weren't eating one another. It talks about your cities being besieged by the enemy, being surrounded. When in the world did that happen? And most of the information that's written in that chapter, if they're talking about it talking about us as black people, most of it has nothing to do, the way it's detailed has nothing to do with when we arrived over here. It sounds like it's talking about when we were still over there. Now, if you can go into history and look back and tell me when certain African tribes known as Semites went through these experiences while they were still on the continent, then you might be able to start convincing me. But when I look back in my history, I don't see where you had African tribes or Hamitic Africans besieging cities owned by supposedly alleged Semite Africans or Semite Hebrews. I don't recall seeing anything about their cities being besieged and the people inside the city having to resort to cannibalism just to survive. But yet, that's written in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. So all I see when it comes down to this is a lot of cherry picking, picking this out, picking that out, and then saying, hey, that relates to black folks. Yes, you can find some things in that chapter that you can say, hey, black folks went through this. Again, I don't have my notes with me to go through and detail everything, but no, I will emphatically say Deuteronomy chapter 28 is not talking about black folks and our experience over here in the Americas. If you want to debate that, put it down in the comments. We'll discuss it down there. I can't address you right now because we're not having a conversation where you're talking back and forth. So if you have questions, if you want to debate that, or if you want to go against and say something different, you can put it down in the comment section. Just let's be respectful, okay? I don't hate you guys. I'm not out there angry at you guys or whatever the case might be. But you might have a different point. Or you might have points that you want to point out to me. Okay? And one last thing that I want to point out that I mentioned in another video. Black Hebrew Israelites will mention, hey, well, look, in Africa, there are certain tribes of Africans that practice Judaistic practices, rituals. They circumcise their sons. They follow certain Jewish rituals that you can find in the Bible. Again, here we go with the correlation and thinking as the source. Did it ever occur to these black Hebrew Israelites that these Africans who are practicing these things may not have originated in Israel at all, but are descendants of Hamitic Africans who converted to Judaism and of course passed on the practices to their children? So you may have been a Hamitic African that just became a Jew by religion, and you consider yourself a Jew, follow Jewish laws and rituals, had children and more children and more children and grandchildren and all the way down the road, and those children carried on your traditions to the point where an entire community could be following Jewish rules and rituals and religions and beliefs and call themselves Jews. That 500 years later, you look at them and say, hey, they're following Jewish practices, so they must be, or they must have originated in Israel. No. There's a thing called conversion. And I'm not denying that you cannot find people in Africa who could possibly trace their roots back to ancient Israel. I'm not denying that. I'm not knocking that. But this idea that all of us black people over here, as they call Negroes, are different from the Africans who are coming from Africa, who live in Africa, I find that to be highly, highly dubious. And I'm skeptical about something like that. But anyway, again, you can go down in the comment section, talk down there. Comment, questions, whatever. Subscribe to the channel also, by the way, okay? Anyway, it's freezing out here. Again, this is your Serial Cynic. Thank you for joining me on this rainy, rainy Sunday afternoon. Okay? So, tell your friends about it. Talk about it amongst yourselves. Show your Hebrew Israelite friend. Take it to your congregation. Your Hebrew Israelites, take it to your congregation. Show it to them. I'm not mad at you guys. I'm here in New York City. I see you guys in the corner all the time. Yeah, I'm not going to sit down there and debate you guys and make a lot of noise and create a YouTube video out of that. I'm not really doing that, okay? But you can come in here and you can debate if you want to. You can ask questions. You can put points down and so forth. And subscribe. All right? Anyway, you guys take care. I'm freezing out here. Thank you again for tuning in, okay? Until the next installment, bye. This is your Serial Cynic.